just a reminder for those y'all, we've got this lab Friday. Tyler and Jeff, are y'all going to it?
Possibly. I'm not.
Okay, because Tyler, you
need to drive to Keysville.
What was that?
Do I need to drive to Keysville?
You can either drive to Keysville or you can meet Tyler there in Alberta and ride in the van to Keysville.
But he's not going.
Oh, he's not going. That's a problem. Well then, yeah, you could show up at Keysville, and I gotta figure out something else if people need to go from Alberta. Okay. But anyway, yeah, we'll be leaving Keysville at about 10. So if you get to the Keysville campus by then.
All right.
Okay, so and for you online people, I need to know hopefully by Wednesday whether you're going with me or not, so I know where y'all are going to be meeting us and stuff. Okay, your class, Ben.
All right. Good morning. Welcome back. So, unfortunately, our class times don't exactly match up here at Virginia Highlands versus Southside and Southwest. So, for you guys at Southside and online, we need to kind of be wrapping everything up next week. The exam will be online, just like last time, same format. And so we're going to finish up in class today and on Wednesday. And if we have enough time, we'll get into a little bit of review on Wednesday. If not, then I will put the review online pretty much immediately. We're also going to pare the crop project down a little bit just to save you guys some time on that because of the scheduling issue. And so we're just going to have just a PowerPoint is all that you need to do for the crop project. And you can use the PowerPoint that is in the module at the very bottom of the Canvas page kind of as a template. Basically, you want to have a slide, you know, kind of corresponding to each slide on there, and just answer those questions. You have a checklist in there as well. And so what I'm going to do today is make a little discussion board. You can post those crop projects, and basically just want everybody to review that PowerPoint slide. So there'll be a little bit of I'll put up a little bit of a lesson on that as well, just kind of a video guide to doing that, just make sure everybody's on the same page. But we'll need to have that in really by Sunday night this week. So more details on that on Wednesday. Also the quizzes.
So that all they have to do is turn in the PowerPoint?
Yeah, just the PowerPoint for the crop projects.
Okay.
And it'll be kind of graded just how it's laid out there as per slide. So I'll give you guys kind of a little rubric kind of to go along with that. So ideally it shouldn't take too long, but we should still at least get some of that information about the individual crops that you all are looking at. The quizzes, I regret that somehow they were not available apparently. So they are all available now except for this week's chapter, and hopefully we'll finish that up today and go ahead and put that up as well. The quizzes I try to make a little bit easier because of that, so I pared them down too. So they shouldn't take too much time. All the PowerPoints are up too, so feel free to use those when you're taking your quiz. All right, well, I think that covers everything for now. Please just email me if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. The sooner the better, so we can address any issues that anybody has. And on that note, we will get back to chapter 16.
Yep. I wasn't expecting, yes.
All right, so we're talking about production and a little bit about marketing as well. So we mentioned on the transportation issue, and the big thing is how do you get your product to the consumer or the distributor? And the big question here is, are you looking at doing a retail kind of direct to consumer type of operation, or are you looking at doing a more wholesale operation? I think it really kind of goes along with what your personality is like. You have to be kind of a personable person if you want to sell direct to customers. There's many different ways to do that, whether it's through the farmer's market, maybe you're selling direct to restaurants, and different skill sets involved for different things, whether you're dealing with the public, maybe people who don't know as much about your crop, or whether you're dealing with, say, a chef who might be more intimately acquainted with how to use the product. So if you are doing some sort of retail as part of your on-site operation, then that goes back to analyzing your site. You know, do you have the facilities to contain those customers? Do you have enough places for people to park? And we also have mentioned several times, and kind of going along with the field trips you all have been on, when we go to these farms, you know, a lot of them have some sort of agritourism perhaps integrated. We're saying that in Virginia now, that's the fastest growing sector of agriculture. It's usually not going to make or break the business per se, but it adds a little bit of extra income, particularly in the off season. So, you know, one thing that a lot of people have been doing is like the corn mazes, for instance. So just a way to get people there, cater to a different group that is not necessarily getting a harvestable product, but getting an experience out of coming to visit your production situation. All right, so things have changed throughout time and with the advent of new agricultural technologies. But the big thing, you know, kind of historically is going from kind of more traditional agriculture systems that were heavily reliant on labor to more resource inputs. So looking at using fossil fuels mostly as, or fossil fuel based inputs as a huge, it's a huge cost, but it can also save a lot of money there. So one of the interesting things about using fuel, let's say if you can use 1 gallon of fossil fuel, it could be equivalent of up to 100 hours of human labor if it is used at the utmost efficiency. So we've reduced labor by using, you know, machinery, but there are some kind of hidden costs associated with that as well. I mean, one is if you're doing it efficiently, then it should, you know, pay for itself. But if you're not operating it efficiently, then it can be more of a drain on resources. So we always want to focus on increased productivity. The sustainability piece we need to think about as well, and not just the environmental sustainability part of it, but also looking at the social aspects. Could you have, where is your labor going? Can you make more of a specialized labor pool so that you can justify paying someone more for a more efficient service, for instance? Also, I mean, the economic sustainability of it. So it costs money to use any kind of fuel. Making sure that you're doing that in a way that makes sense economically too. So really the value of the crop itself is a big factor in determining what inputs we are using. So just as an example here, say that fungicides, for instance, we can use during the production of high value crops, but in something like grain production, it could be cost prohibitive to use fungicides because you're looking at it as more of an extensive sense. It's field based. It costs a lot more to apply those fungicides to a wide range of land there. So in that case, it might not be, you know, economically feasible to actually apply the fungicide? Does the use of any input, make it to where, how does it affect the margins really of your end product? We're already kind of working on thin margins. So anything that you add in there, you want to make sure that it is actually going to meet an economic threshold and make sense to use. So we look at that in terms of the value of the crop, which is really based on how much is the consumer willing to pay for it, which of course is also going to be based on the supply and demand of it. One thing that I would really recommend if anybody wants to, go into like vegetable crop production is looking at some of these wholesalers and distributors and looking at where these margins are, higher than other crops. For instance, we used to get the Cisco and US Foods, the two big distributors in our area to restaurants, used to get their price lists. And if you can, basically charge less than or the same as one of these distributors, then and look at those high value items and producing those, then that could be a good way to make some extra money. One thing that we found is that some very specialized items like golden beets, for instance, were in such low supply but in such high demand that it caused the price that the distributors were charging to be fairly high. And we could really go below that price in our production situation. So we look at all of the inputs that we put into it and we balance it with, what is the price that we can sell it to, for to the consumer, to the end consumer, and can we balance that in such a way that the margins that we're getting are larger. So another interesting thing on looking at the conventional and traditional production systems, we're now, we mentioned this before, looking at preserving, restoring, and creating wetlands, and actually incorporating these into some conventional production and utilization systems where it makes sense, where that maybe the ecological function of that wetland does more for you than just turning it into cropland. On this kind of organic growing system idea, we look at USDA or third-party certification of organic crops. And really what it boils down to is mostly as a premium price or a premium pricing opportunity. Basically saying that your constituency, your customer base is willing to pay more for a product or service that is labeled in such a way. And so that has given rise to this whole organic industry. So it's a multi-billion-dollar industry now based on these certifications, saying that we're going to, agree to only use these particular inputs in this particular production style so that it is organic, and someone certifies that, and then the end consumer is willing to pay more for it. Something to look at, but I would also throw out there that many of the growers, especially in our area, might use organic practices, but they do not actually become certified due to the difficulty and expense of it. So again, it goes back to your end consumer. What are they willing to pay for? How much more are they willing to pay for that premium pricing opportunity? There's been a lot more that have popped up along the lines of, kind of the natural grown or maybe local grown, kind of regional certifications as well as national or international. On the international front, there's one called biodynamic, which uses, it's kind of, in some cases, more stringent than organic, but it's kind of like a really big thing in Europe and Pacific Northwest, for instance. So again, is your customer willing to pay more for a particular certification? doesn't make sense to pay for that certification. I was talking to a grower just the other day who was actually, their farm was called Abingdon Organics. They were organic growers certified for many, many years, but as the cost of certification has risen to now we're looking at $300-400 a year to be certified, they feel that that's cutting into their margin. So their customers, they already know that they are growing organic, but they don't actually certify themselves as it anymore because they don't need to. So it's something to look at. And there are standards in the USDA that basically say that you can sell a certain amount of the product as non-certified organic once you reach that threshold, and I think it's like $4,000. Once you meet that threshold, then you have to be certified, actually go through the hoops. So on the whole sustainability front, we look at sustainable agriculture. Any kind of sustainability is trying to meet the needs of the present without compromising the needs of future generations. So kind of a heady thing, heady concept there, difficult to really put that into, production. I mean, how is what I'm doing now, affecting my farm's ability to, act in the future? And so we could take that, for example, looking at using synthetic fertilizers. If you continually use them without, flushing out the soil, you build up the salinity of the soil. In one way, it's not sustainable just to continually use only synthetic fertilizers. You have to vary it up in a way to meet that sustainability need. Just a simple example there. So they mentioned in the book there, kind of looking at a sustainable cropping system of slash and burn agriculture. The Native Americans, for instance, did this, in the eastern U.S., where they would basically let it go back to forests. They would cut it, burn it, practice agriculture there, but they would only do that for a few years, and then they would leave that land fallow, in some cases for up to like 50 years. So environmentally friendly, yeah, but economically, is that sustainable? Not really. I mean, you can't leave that much land fallow for several decades. So we've kind of changed. I mean, we don't really practice slash and burn anymore in North America. They're still practicing it in South America to a certain extent, places like in Africa as well. But most industrialized nations, that land, that most arable land is already being used. So we have to figure out how to make more product off of smaller areas of land so we don't have to use these types of environmentally friendly agriculture. On the sustainable front here, there's actually a branch of the USDA called the Sustainable Agricultural Research and Education Program that has kind of developed some guidelines, and they often have grant funding opportunities for farmers. So it's interesting to look at what they're doing and what they're awarding grants for, to do like some on-farm research and production. So they look at it as providing a more profitable farm income, the economic sustainability, also the environmental sustainability, looking at protecting and improving soil, reducing the dependence on non-renewable resources, such as any fossil fuel-based fertilizers or pesticides, reducing it, not eliminating it. Also minimizing the adverse impacts on safety, wildlife, water quality, other environmental resources, while promoting stable, prosperous farm families and communities. So you kind of get all those areas of sustainability in there, the social, the economic, and the environmental ideas. One thing that we're moving towards kind of on the technological front and food safety front is some sort of certification system. And we look at these as being like the gaps, for instance, the good agricultural practices, or the BMPs, the best management practices for particular resources. When we look at these certification systems, they're all kind of looking at these key elements: sustainable crop production, managing ecosystems, conserving the resources, integrating waste management, offering fair labor practices, providing some community benefits, as well as just getting a quality product out there. The big thing though here that we're looking at in these certification systems is safety and purity, in particular from other biological organisms. So we also look at the practices that are looking at the agroecosystem, the agriculture as well as the ecology associated with it. Looking at, on the IPM front, looking at those that are using biological, mechanical, and cultural methods first before using chemical methods, minimizing those chemical inputs, again, because they cost money as well as can be potentially environmentally and human health degrading. Gosh, excuse me, I can't talk today. And we look at different ways of managing these resources. So both the long-term and short-term practices of managing soil, water, nutrients, because they go together really. All right, so first on the environmental factors, we've kind of already mentioned this, but looking at just how you're arranging your crops in a row. The row orientation, the plant spacing, as ways to manipulate the light and influencing how we're maximizing the light, something that we, in a field setting, we cannot add in there. We can only influence it by how our crops are arranged. And that's going to vary around the world, looking at your latitude and your season and when you're, basically producing the crop. So we look at the different planting dates, the different styles of row orientation. Generally, at our latitude, we're going to have arranged things going north to south, so that they're not shading each other. Each row is not shading the other one out. In conventional row production, we're looking at seeding an entire field, or we can look at it on the row spacings themselves. So thinking like a 3 to 4 foot wide bed, for instance. After we've produced the crop, we look at the harvest as being kind of the final step of production. And there's all kinds of different ways to look at harvesting different crops. Sometimes this can usually is the most labor intensive part of the production of the crop. So how do you basically make that labor the most efficient? And we look at that in terms of using different forms of agriculture technology to make the harvest as easy and efficient as possible. So looking here at cranberry production, they're basically flooding entire areas so that the fruit floats to the top, and they push it onto this mechanical harvester here. All of this is going to be, particular to the crop itself, and going to vary highly based on that crop. Maybe you have to hire additional labor to harvest the crop. Maybe you're harvesting it by a machine. Those are the things that we have to look at. And the big thing here, as we're harvesting, looking at minimizing damage so it does not lose value. So originally, most harvesting was done by hand. And to this day, most of our fresh market vegetables, fruits, and cut flowers are still picked by hand. So that requires a ton of labor and a lot of time. But you've gone to the effort of producing the crop. now how do you get it in the hands of the consumer, the people that are paying for it? So for most of our other crops, all of our commodified and subsidized crops, harvesting has been mechanized. So here we are using a combine to harvest cotton. This all began with cereal grains, so we moved from the scythe to the tractor, the scythe of the harrow to the tractor, and that has greatly reduced human labor, as you might imagine. This is one of those examples where that, 1 gallon of fuel could easily equal 100 hours of human labor. Just imagine being out here in this field of barley and having to just harvest it by a scythe. Many people would have been involved in that, and traditionally communities would come together to harvest. So you would combine your labor in some efforts, and in some cases that's still happening today. The downside of the mechanization of our harvest is that it has also increased the need for fuel. And if you've been following the prices of diesel, it fluctuates a ton. It becomes more difficult to harvest crops and make it economically viable when the fuel cost is high. A lot of farmers I know will actually have purchased fuel tanks when the cost of fossil fuel is low. They fill up those tanks at home, so they have a long-term fuel source. The downside of that is fuel degrades when it's stored, so we have to have some fresh fuel coming in. So we look at mechanization as being developed for crops intended mostly for processing, because generally through some sort of mechanical harvesting, we're often limiting, or we're often injuring it somehow. So there are still some that are have been mechanized, and again, the technology is developing in some cases for people are engineering very specific harvesters for specific crops that minimize that injury. So here we have a mechanical picker of sweet corn. You pull that through the entire row, it's picking it without damaging the sweet corn. But as you can imagine, that costs money to do that. So in many cases, a lot of the sweet corn is still picked by hand. Again, does the value of the crop allow there to be enough wiggle room to purchase an implement? Will that implement pay for itself in time? Those are things that we have to look at in terms of bringing this mechanization to our harvests. Here we have some for leaf lettuce, so there are now mechanical harvesters for that, and they've also created some for small scale production as well. It looks basically like a drill that you mount on this harvester, and it's basically a canvas bag with a cutting bar on the base of it, and as you go along the row, it's basically tumbling that lettuce in there. So there are some things on a small scale, some things on a large scale, but we look at that mechanical harvest again, specific implements for specific crops, but also noting that there is still hand picking taking place in most of our production. Here's just an example of for not cut hands, cut flowers. So they're still harvesting it at some point by hand, but in this case, they're taking things like roses and carnations, and they're putting them through these machines that are stripping the leaves, trimming the stems, and sorting the flowers by size and quality. So there's some implements that might not be used in direct harvest, but are used to increase the efficiency and hopefully to increase the margin that we're getting by making whatever harvest or post-harvest processing more efficient. We've also come a long way in using digital technology, computers and electronic sensors in harvesting equipment, as well as, in some cases, just when to harvest to improve that harvest efficiency. So one example could be using GPS, the global positioning systems, to allow field equipment to be controlled precisely as it moves through a field. You can also have yield sensors so that we're minimizing the amount of grain that's left in the field in some cases, or moisture sensors to record the moisture content of any item as it's being harvested. We look at this in terms of, they're now bricks sensors, and that's a measure of sugars in a crop. So they use that a lot in like wine production for wine, or for grape production for wine. Also in some cases for tomatoes, even making sure that they have the right harvest indicators. After we've harvested it, we look at the ability to actually store it for later consumption. And this was critical in the development of agriculture, and as for a societal kind of idea here. I mean, if you think about it, life in North America and Europe would have been impossible without the ability to store food for the winter. So how do you harvest the crop and treat it after you've harvested it to be able to store it for long periods of time? So even with technology and looking at the harvest indexes, the indicators of when to harvest it, how to harvest it, we still have lots of losses after harvest. So we have to limit post-harvest deterioration as a way to become more sustainable for the world's food supply too. Here's just a table looking at the parts of the plant that are harvested, the plant stage of development that it is harvested in. So just something to take a look at. Some of this is kind of interesting. Thinking, for instance, about tomatoes kind of go both ways. We harvest them when they're mature, vine ripe, or we can also harvest them when they're immature, still green, and then gas them. So a different post-harvest treatment depending on how it was harvested. All plant products are going to deteriorate as they are harvested, after they're harvested. And there are many different reasons why this happens. First, just the whole biological process. The crop itself continuing to respire after it's harvested, but also the presence of some pests or pathogens cause rots, for instance. So we have the physical deterioration often begins at harvest. Once it's separated from the plant, whether it continues to ripen or not and respire or not is an important thing to look at. How it's going to be marketed and consumed, what part of the plant is being used. Often the plant is most susceptible, the product is most susceptible at peak ripeness. So we're often damaging them when we are harvesting them, unfortunately. So trying to look at ways to minimize that. We look at many of our fruits and seeds as being harvested as just part of the natural separation from the parent plant. So looking at the abscission zones and that abscisic acid, that growth hormone that comes into play, it causes the fruit to basically drop. So looking at melons, for instance, like cantaloupes, we have slipping types, and they will slip or basically just pull off of the vine when they are ripe. So that's just taking advantage of that natural abscission. But we can also promote that with the use of growth regulators. And in some cases, we might want to delay abscission to avoid loss of a crop. It's all crop dependent. And we talk about this as the very first beginning of agriculture and the grain crops. So we intentionally or kind of unintentionally, depending on how we look at it, selected for crops that would basically retain the seed. They would not shatter, so that you could come back and harvest it, and then separate that grain from threshing. Threshing we look at as being a forceful process where we're separating, especially in grains or in seed crops, the actual seed itself from the chaff. And in doing so, if we are damaging it, then we're opening it up and making it more susceptible to insect and disease infestation, which further reduces the quality and value of it. So in some examples, we look at harvesting fruits and seeds when the abscission zone is not fully developed. And in that case, we have to actually cut or physically break the whatever supporting enclosure or structure that it is attached to the plant on, which can result in wound areas as well. So in some cases, physical damage at harvest is unavoidable. So one way of preventing some post-harvest deterioration, as we see here in shipping plants, for cut flowers and potted plants, we might place them in a protective sleeve to protect them during shipping, which is still going to allow air exchange that prevents the buildup of that ethylene inside the sheath. So if you look closely, this plastic bag this guy's putting over the poinsettia has breathable holes in it there. So after you harvest it, how do you package it? How do you handle it? How do you transport it? Designing those systems to minimize mechanical damage is important, because this is a major cause of crop loss after harvest. So we look at that being simplified if that's part of the mature structure of the plant and is naturally involved in long-term survival of the plant. So for example, in the case of winter squash, we generally want them to somewhat dry on the plant, and we'll cut the stems, leaving about ½ inch to 1 inch of the stem on the end of it as a way to basically keep that mature structure on there to prevent organisms from coming into the squash and causing it to further deteriorate after we've harvested it. If we look at seed crops, they lose their ability to germinate over time due to just the biological changes in the cells of those seeds as well as the genetic material. In the food crops, deterioration can be associated with the development of off flavors that render it unflavorable, in some cases unpalatable. So an example of the potato here or onions, when they sprout, that can actually cause flavor changes as well as physical changes in the actual bulb or tuber itself. So this potato, now that it's sprouted, it's developing, it's moving water out of that potato into these sprouts. Therefore, it's starting to get a little wrinkly. Doesn't taste as good at that point. Also, when they sprout and if they get sun contact and they start to turn a little green, they actually will, develop some toxins in the skin too. So don't eat a green potato, right? In that case, not only unpalatable, but potentially unhealthy. So immature structures, things like green peas, snap peas, sweet corn, green onions, these are very perishable crops. Or things like asparagus, flowers, cut flowers, all these are very perishable. So looking at the timing of harvest is very important. So we're looking at harvesting these when basically the plant is moving the energy into that harvestable portion of the crop. When that process is interrupted, that metabolism will remain rapid, but there's not any nutrient supply from the main plant, so it causes it often to spoil. Spoilage we look at often is yellowing or premature senescence of the crop itself. In dry seed crops, we look at insects as being a huge issue. So trying to harvest them when insects are at a minimum is something that we look at, but also keeping them out once we've harvested it. So where we store it, we try to keep it completely sanitary. Rodents also can be a big problem in seed crops. So we develop particular places, environments that try to prevent them from entering. We also look at diseases, the fungal attack of all kinds of crops. During or after harvest, it's also conducive to rotting of many different types of crops, especially our softer fruits. Few species of botrytis or penicillium can actually cause devastating problems. They look like, to us, they look like mold. They're actually the physical, the signs of the presence of the organism that then, once they're growing, they generate ethylene and they cause the others around them. So if you look at grocery stores, for instance, many of them have, basically created policies where if some of it starts to rot, they throw the whole display away because those fungal organisms move very quickly. We're talking about the quality of a crop product. We're looking at it as being defined as the fitness for a particular purpose. So what is that being used for? Is it fresh market, or is it going to be used for processing? Different quality indicators for both of those. For most crops, the market quality standards are set by the USDA and some other third-party organizations, looking at minimum standards for size, shape, color, and also just a lack of any kind of physical damage or blemishes on them. This is often somewhat associated with the nutritional content. Big thing on nutrients, they're always better when there's always more nutrients available when the crop is fresh. For I'd say probably 99% of our crops. So as we harvest it, as it sits around, it's continuing to deteriorate. Those nutrients are breaking down. So a premium pricing opportunity that I've seen a lot being used is just fresh. This was harvested within this week. So the harvested crops, depending on what kind of situation you're in, are inspected either by the farmer themselves, or by a third-party inspector to make sure that they're meeting the quality standards. All of our commodified and subsidized crops, it's a third party that is inspecting them. Nutritional quality, of course, is a concern, and federal law requires that food products carry that nutritional information with them. We can also look at quality in terms of post-harvest treatments or pre-harvest treatments from pesticides. Pesticide poisoning from commercially produced food is almost unknown, and that's due to these high standards for you have to stop using this pesticide at this, within a certain number of days of harvest. Many harmful organisms can get into our food supply, and we've seen this a lot, not just in 2006 or 2008, but outbreaks of E. coli and Salmonella on usually pre-harvest and post-harvest treatments coincide with this. And this is where the good agricultural practices and the safety standards are really coming in. So we look at bulk handling and wide distribution methods and our modern cropping, as a very important way to make it more efficient, but it also makes the whole system more vulnerable to the spread of waterborne organisms such as E. coli. So microbial safety is a huge focus in quality. And I would just say here, I mean, the more records that you can keep, the better records that you can keep, the more likely you are to try to prevent that. And one of the issues with this E. coli outbreak is often due to just worker sanitation itself. So migrant workers coming in, I mean, you have to be sure that they practice cleanliness. So sanitation happens at all points, but it's especially important in harvesting and handling, post-harvest handling of the crops. When it comes to the consumer satisfaction, we look at the physical attributes that actually affect the crop itself, but we also look at the hedonic attributes. These are things that are basically the aesthetic appreciation, the form and the color, the smell and the eating quality of it, that are more based on the aesthetics rather than just the actual, physical crop itself. So we have to look at that as well. What does the consumer, want? How can you train your consumer to be, amenable and acceptable for, say, a new crop, for instance? We started growing like the blue and purple tomatoes, and for some people, that's, they haven't seen that before, so they don't accept it immediately. If you tell them about the benefits of, all right, well, this blue tomato actually has higher antioxidants than a regular tomato, then they can, kind of overcome those hedonic standards that are kind of formed as what their expectations are of the crop. On the post-harvest treatment, we look at the specific measures taken to maintain that crop's quality from the time of the harvest onward. So for some crops, we look at that as being a curing period, where often it's kind of accompanied with drying. Usually drying goes first and then curing after drying. Drying, taking place often with sunlight, curing out of the sun. This can allow wounds incurred in harvesting to heal, often in crops like potatoes, onions, things that have thicker skins. Winter squash. We also look at moisture content. So low moisture content is critical for successful storage of all dry crops, especially seeds and grains. And generally, we look at that as being around 13%. If it's any higher than that, then you have to dry it further. And so in some cases, they use forced hot air treatments. You can also use some chemical treatments to prevent various kinds of deterioration in a wide variety of crops that minimizes their losses. However, there's a lot of public opinion opposing the use of that. There is a new one that I noticed the other day when my students brought it to my attention. A scientist basically figured out how to make a cutin-based covering. So it's just like the skin of a fruit or that waxy cuticle-like covering of some leaves and plants. They've looked at a way to use a polymer to apply that to some crops to basically reduce post-harvest damage. It's called Appeal, and they're using that at our local Kroger store here. They're putting it on avocados. So they ripen so quickly off the tree, they deteriorate so quickly. So they're saying this can save months of harvest time on it. I'll try to put a link up to share that with you guys about the Appeal. It's pretty interesting. Anyway, post-harvest treatments being in conjunction with the agriculture technology to make sure that they're safe for people, but also that it's cost effective. And we're past time, so I'm going to go ahead and sign off for now. And we will finish up on this post-harvest handling and hopefully get a little bit into the review on Wednesday. So again, just before we sign off, just contact me if you have any questions or concerns. I'm going to try to get up the example PowerPoint for you guys to go by for your crop project today.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
That flower machine that you showed a picture of, that it pulls the leaves and the thorns, that kind of stuff off the flower without messing up the petals. How in the world does that work?
It's basically, it's kind of like a conveyor belt, and it's dependent on the flower. So they only have it for a few different types of flowers, mostly carnations and roses. So it's specifically designed to have, like, basically the tubes come through, and it's like a mechanical stripper that pulls it off. It has a sensor that senses when the flower is actually coming in contact with it, so it knows to stop stripping too.
Okay, it's like an infrared sensor or something like that?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, just, that kind of blew my mind a little bit.
It's pretty cool. And I mean, but it's only applicable in those high value flowers like roses and carnations. So far, anyway.
Okay. Thank you. Now I know.
Have a great day.
Okay, is Hunter there?
He is.